Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Free Market Foundation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Martin van Staden. I'm the head of legal policy and research here. Thank you all for joining us. As you all probably know, given that you're here tonight, liberalism has been in the news and on the lips of the commentariat for about a year now. And in my lifetime, at least, it is the most attention that the philosophy of liberty has gotten, in the national conscious, at least, and in quite a while, at least since the end of apartheid, I think. And a short while before the furor about liberalism started again in the last few years, Professor Dan Klein of George Mason University asked me to write an article for a peer-reviewed journal in the Canadian Fraser Institute about the history and the character of South African liberalism. This was published last September 2019 and is available freely for all of you to read if you feel so inclined. It's in my bio in the invitations that you received for this event. And this article is what inspired us to arrange this panel discussion. And it was easy to determine who to have on the panel besides myself. Our two guest speakers are not only affiliated with the two organizations around which most of the discourse around liberalism has focused over the last year, but both of them have written, spoken, and presumably definitely fought widely about liberalism, its values and its applications, particularly in the South African context. I don't think either of them truly need an introduction for a crowd of this nature, but please allow me to go for the John Kane-Berman is a senior policy fellow and the former CEO of the Institute of Race Relations. He's a graduate of the University of the Witwatersrand, and there very importantly led a protest against the apartheid government's policy of racial segregation at universities, leading the Prime Minister at the time, John Foster, to call him and his delegation little pink liberals. That's how we're perceived by many who call themselves conservative. He is also a graduate of the University of Oxford, where he was John spent 10 years in journalism as a senior assistant editor of the Financial Mail and the South African correspondent of numerous foreign newspapers. He's the author of several books on South African politics and recently published his memoirs, which I can highly recommend. Gwen Ngwenya started her career as an economic analyst working in New Delhi in India, covering the pharmaceutical, airline, and cement industries. From New Delhi, she was recruited by Bloomberg to work as an analyst covering Europe, Middle East, and Africa from their offices in London. She moved back to South Africa in 2016, joining the IRR as its chief operating officer, and became a member of parliament for the DA, serving on its standing committee on finance. She has degrees from the University of Cape Town and the University of Paris, where she completed a master's thesis on cartelization in India. She's currently the head of federal policy at the Democratic Alliance. Last and certainly least in this august company, I am the head of legal at the FMF. I am pursuing an LLM at the University of Pretoria on the topic of liberty and transformation in our law. And I authored a book published last year, The Constitution and the Rule of Law, which is available for purchase at the reception for only 150 Rand. I'm a passionate writer and editor, but above all, I'm a passionate liberal. And I hope you all join me in enjoying this evening. Please allow me to welcome our first speaker, John Kane-Berman.
Thank you, Martin, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be giving this talk only a few days after the United Kingdom struck a blow for liberalism by executing the European Union, or exiting rather. That was a wonderful Freudian slip, I must say. Democratic accountability and minimal regulation are key components of liberalism, and the EU typifies the opposite. Although we will, of course, have to wait and see how much of an economic liberal Boris Johnson turns out to be. Liberalism in South Africa is part of our British heritage. The cradle was the Cape, under renewed British rule from 1806. Milestones included commitments to a free press and an independent judiciary in 1827 and the abolition of slavery in 1834. Yet another milestone was the establishment in 1853 of a legislature elected on a common voters' roll, though with qualifications which were raised as more people met them. When the Cape got self-governing status in 1872, the colony incorporated institutions that included the rule of law and equality before the law. At the National Convention, which led to the establishment of the Union of South Africa in 1910, attempts by Cape Liberals to extend the non-racial franchise to other provinces were rebuffed, and they agreed reluctantly to confine it to the Cape. But it was to be protected by entrenched clauses. And it was not until 1956 that the National Party finally abolished the common role franchises, but only after ex-servicemen and women had fought hard to protect both the limited coloured franchise and the entrenched clauses. Though probably only a minority of the members of organisations such as the Torch Commando were liberals, the fight to protect the franchise and to defend the entrenched clauses was a liberal cause. South Africa's two major liberal parties, the Liberal Party, founded in 1953, and the Progressive Party, founded in 1959, distinguished themselves from other parties seeking white electoral support by their opposition to racial discrimination and their support for extending the franchise, initially subject to various qualifications and later on the basis of universal adult suffrage. And that was, in fact, a momentous development. Professor Alfred Hernley, a German-born philosopher who was president of the Institute of Race Relations from 1934 to 1943, had earlier observed that the classical doctrine of European liberalism did not contemplate how it would work in a multiracial society. The classical thinkers had no first-hand experience of such a society. South African liberals therefore had to feel their way. Some of them experimented intellectually with total racial separation. Most recognized that this was economically impossible. Now, although dismissed as idealists, liberals were realistic in recognizing that one could not impose a straitjacket of political apartheid upon an irreversibly industrializing economy. Liberal opposition to such things as the homeland system, forced removals, and the pass laws was founded upon both moral and practical objections. Liberals also recognized that a modern economy could not be built upon racial restrictions. This was no more than common sense, but most whites deluded themselves otherwise. This crusade against apartheid was not waged only by political parties. Liberal newspapers, student organizations, universities, institutions in civil society, liberal lawyers and trade unionists, liberals in the churches and in business were all parts of the campaign for a common society. Inevitably, whites dominated many of these organizations. Black liberals were fighting alongside them, but also in other organizations, including the African National Congress, before its turn to violence and communist alliance. Black liberals played prominent roles in the ANC in its early years, and black newspapers and journalists made their mark in the Cape, in particular, in the late 19th century. Liberalism in South Africa has never been confined to whites. Another key distinguishing feature was opposition to bannings, detention without trial, and other restrictions on free political activity. At the same time, liberals fought for the elimination of the industrial colour bar, the granting of trade union rights to blacks, and for equal opportunities in education and elsewhere. Many of these liberals were quietly heroic. Helen Suzman would never have remained in Parliament without dedicated, unpaid volunteer work, week in and week out, year in and year out, by ordinary people who went house to house canvassing and doing other essential constituency work. I'm sure that Jill Wenzel, who's sitting in front of me, would be able to name some of the names. These people, their abhorrence of the Nats, as they were called, and their belief in justice and the common law, rather than ideological conviction, is what motivated them. They were, of course, members of a minority fighting for majority rule. This did not happen in too many other places. One consequence of the all-embracing nature of apartheid and the need to oppose it in all its facets was that some of the great issues that exercised liberals elsewhere were largely overlooked. For example, the great cause of free trade, which led to divisions in British politics that endured at least twice as long as the divisions over Europe. The crusade against apartheid saw liberals and others making common cause. But there were divisions. Many prominent liberals thus declined to attend the Congress of the People in 1950 on the grounds that this was a communist enterprise. This decision angered many liberals. The Liberal Party itself was virtually destroyed when some of its members turned to violence in the 1960s. The divisions then deepened in the 1980s over sanctions and violence. Some liberals identified with Desmond Tutu in the crusade for economic sanctions against South Africa. Others agreed with Mangosuthu Buthelezi in his opposition to sanctions. Some liberals were delighted with campaigns for no education before liberation. Others were horrified. The violence of the terrible years between 1983 and 1994 caused even greater divisions. Some white liberals took the view that no white person was entitled to criticize strategies that black people used to liberate themselves. Others argued that liberals had a duty to speak out against violence, irrespective of whether it was perpetrated by the security forces or by liberatory organizations. Divisions continued over the 1996 Constitution. Some liberals embraced its horizontal application and its entrenchment of socio-economic rights. And in fact, the first great disputes between the Institute and various members of the what was then the DA caucus were over those very issues in the early 1990s. Other people sought to have the certification of the Constitution rejected on the grounds that these provisions, that's the socio-economic rights provisions, opened the way to socialism. It thus became clear that many people who had previously fought together under the same liberal banner were now splitting into classical liberals on the one hand and social democrats and socialists on the other. But the divisions were not that neat, and they still aren't that neat. Some liberals regard the present government's racial legislation as fundamentally illiberal, but some people who regard themselves as liberal think race-based affirmative action is necessary to redress the wrongs of the past. Some liberals favor much more redistribution to reduce inequality. Others believe that the emphasis should be on liberalizing the economy to remove obstacles to faster growth. In fact, I think that what has happened over the last few decades is a division of the broad old liberal constituency into libertarians and classical liberals on the one hand, and social democrats and what the Americans call left liberals on the other. But even then, distinctions are blurred. I have liberal friends who abominate Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, but others who would like to see Trump re-elected as they see him as an antidote to political correctness. I have liberal friends who are persuaded that climate change is one of the greatest threats humanity has ever faced, while others think Donald Trump is 100% correct to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and that world leaders who kowtow to Greta Thunberg are half mad. Moreover, some liberals, contemplating events in recent years, might reluctantly agree that General Smuts was right when in 1943, I think it was, he asked, "What will it profit this country if justice is done to the underdog and the whole caboodle, including that underdog, is then handed over to the wreckers?" What of minorities? Liberals have usually refused to contemplate any constitutional recognition of group rights. Partly, this is a reaction to the previous government's divide and rule homelands policy. But it is also the logical outcome of a belief that rights attach to individuals, not to groups. Those who argue that some sort of constitutional protection should be provided for minority groups as groups are told that the best protection for minorities is a decentralized political system with entrenched individual rights protected by an independent judiciary. Hence the support among many liberals, black and white, for federalism. But ladies and gentlemen, the history of the first 25 years of ANC rule makes me wonder if these kinds of protections against majoritarian tyranny are sufficient, and whether perhaps liberals have been a bit naive. The Constitutional Court has shown hostility to Afrikaners in two important decisions, one over street names in Pretoria and the other over the use of Afrikaans at the University of the Free State. In the first of these cases, in which AfriForum had sought to interdict the changing of certain street names, the Chief Justice rebuked that organization for using the Constitution, as he put it, to advance illegitimate sectarian interests. These and other remarks by the Chief Justice suggest that it would be unwise for minorities to rely too heavily on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitutional Court for the protection of language, cultural, employment, and other rights. This means that organizations such as AfriForum are important. They do not emanate from the liberal tradition, but liberals should welcome the role that they are playing. My last points. Opinion surveys have consistently shown that most South Africans have liberal views on race. Moreover, despite the flaws I've mentioned, the 1996 Constitution contains many liberal features. These are now under threat. The greatest battles for liberals are still to come. Thank you.
Please welcome Gwen Ngwenya to the podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I should also perhaps say friends, because I'm not often in the midst of friendly company when I discuss ideological matters. So it's always very good to feel that I'm with friends, essentially. One point I do think I should make before I begin is that for someone with a great deal of other policy interests, as perhaps you may have gleaned from my brief bio, I'm called upon to speak on race a great deal. And I'm starting to think that perhaps people think I have nothing interesting to say other than on race. I'll have to disabuse everyone of that notion someday. But for tonight, I will talk on the topic that I've been given, on liberalism and non-racialism. And essentially, I would like to leave everyone with three ideas, I suppose, by the end of this evening. The first is because I like to never leave everyone too comfortable, is a sober-minded view of the relationship or the history between liberalism and non-racialism, and say the two have a complicated history with one another, and that perhaps liberals don't deserve such a high perch on the issue of non-racialism. The second is to say there is a difference between non-racialism and multiracialism. And it is important in my mind to distinguish the consequences of that difference, and I'll spend the bulk of the talk focusing on that particular distinction. The third is then to ask for us to perhaps make strange bedfellows in the pursuit of non-racialism. So on the first point about liberalism's complicated history with the idea of non-racialism, I'd like to begin by saying that Enlightenment thinking forms the bedrock of what many of us today consider to be the foundations of liberal thought. The radical idea then, of course, was that humans did not need to live their lives or understand the world through the prism of religious divination, but that man has agency, the ability to acquire knowledge, and thus rule as sovereign over his own life. One could obviously deliver an entirely separate speech on the limits of free will and human rationality, but it suffices to say that we may express these ideas, that although we may express these ideas with qualification, they do continue to be a powerful foundation for a modern society. But in the 19th century, as classical liberalism was entrenching itself in Europe and Western society more broadly, The same nations were engaged in a bloody and oppressive subversion of the sovereignty of people in what would be its colonies, typically justified on the basis of racial difference. Liberal philosophers such as Locke, Kant, and Hume were not proponents of the kind of non-racialism we would today so casually regard as liberalism proper. And this is no more evident than in Hume's own words, where he says, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes, and in general all other species of men, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was any civilized nation of any complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent in action or speculation." So South Africa's history too suggests that South African liberals do not have an uncomplicated past with non-racialism. The most obvious is the support for some time and of some liberals of a qualified franchise. Now, whatever the arguments about pragmatic position versus ideological position, it presents a stain on what some might wish to be an unblemished non-racial record. I am cautious, however, to judge history through a current lens. There are many incrementalisms throughout history which, when judged on their own, appear as unacceptable concessions, but which undoubtedly at the time helped to edge nearer the later capitulation of an oppressive order. The point simply to make is that we should not take it as a given that liberals inherently sit on a pedestal on the issue of non-racialism. South Africa today is founded on the idea of non-racialism. The word appears numerous times, appears in our constitution. Yet there is little common understanding of what the term means. The confusion is not new, of course. For many years, words such as non-racial and multiracial were used with apparently no distinction. In 1985, R. Tambo was eager to address precisely this definitional issue. And he said, there must be a difference. That is why we say non-racial. We could have said multiracial if we had wanted to, but there is a difference. We mean non-racial rather than multiracial. And what we mean is, and he says that multiracial does not address the question of racism. Non-racial does. There will be no racism of any kind, and therefore no discrimination that proceeds from the fact that people happen to be members of different races. That is what we understand by non-racial. But does R. Tambo's clarification in the above quote help to move us closer to a crisp distinction between non-racialism and multiracialism? I don't believe it does. I think it's equally confused. Now, the reason race is still such a soft spot for South Africa, well, partially or in large part, is that we have all but fudged what non-racialism means. Now, it means all things to all people, and as a consequence, there is no shared vision for the future of race relations in this country. Is the future one where different races can get along and live in harmony, or is the future one where race is delegitimized and people relate to each other on an entirely different basis without race as a frame of reference? Now, those two conceptions of non-racialism cannot live together at the same time. We cannot mean both these things when we talk about non-racialism. A lack of clarity on the kind of society we wish to build has consequences for nation building. And we cannot defend a shared social compact when there's rampant political confusion of its place and meaning. Now, the two contested interpretations are principally, as I've highlighted, a distinction between multiracialism and non-racialism. In popular parlance, South Africa is referred to as the Rainbow Nation. Now, I'm going to repeat what I said recently when I spoke at a different event, is that in the early 90s, which is kind of where this phrase began to be popularized, Archbishop Desmond Tutu said to a crowd in an audience, "Move your hands, look at your hands, different colors representing different people. You are the rainbow people of God." Now, rainbowism, the idea of different race groups living together in harmony, requires color consciousness, not the negation of it. For many, it is the compelling idea that people of different races could live together in harmony as one people. While this sounds noble, the challenge is that rainbowism concedes race in order to offer up the hope of different races living together in harmony, meaning that under a rainbowism ideology or concept, it is not per se illegitimate to think of people as belonging to different racial groups, as long as we can all live together in harmony. Now, this to me is the domain of multiracialism, not non-racialism. Non-racialism distinguishes itself from multiracialism by stressing the illegitimacy of race from first principles as being bad in science and bad philosophically. That race is bad science should not be controversial. There are no discrete racial groups, and that shouldn't be a controversial idea, although it increasingly is becoming so. The idea of distinct races whose physical appearance conformed with differences in values, aptitudes, and competencies was crucial, in fact, to justifying a system of oppression. That we now know this fact to be false is not something to be coy about. But if race is false, if then race is false, it obviously still is a useful, some might say, social construct. However, if the question is race a social construct, the follow-up question should be, what then can we do to deconstruct it? That is the question which bedevils non-racialists. What do we do to deconstruct what is an illegitimate social construct? Now, philosophically, questions such as what are the criteria that differentiate one racial group from another, and what are the shared goals or beliefs that characterize the group, all of these are near impossible to build a coherent ontology of race around. But it is important that rejecting race for the non-racialist is not the same as rejecting racism or denying that racism exists. Racism and prejudice do not require race to be real in order to exist. We know that many bad events in human history have occurred on the basis of false beliefs. Racism and prejudice are very real, but they do not require race to be real. And this is an important point to emphasize. What they only require is a false belief in racial difference. So when we understand this distinction between non-racialism and multiracialism, we can understand why terms like colorblind have become so vilified. Because colorblindness follows non-racialism. It does not follow multiracialism, and ours is a deeply multiracial society. Colorblindness is the idea that while skin color is clearly observable, one's thoughts, opinions, and experiences of shared events are unique. So we do not attach color to values, expertise, ideology, etc. What we mean by color blindness is that we are blind to assuming what your skin color tells us about all of these other attributes. We get to know someone before jumping to conclusions based on their physical appearance. Or at the least, we aspire to, because color blindness is also a normative value. I suppose, by the way, aren't all values. They are not necessarily descriptive. It tells us primarily how we would like to be, not how we always are. The idea of color blindness now increasingly appears to be outmoded and out of touch. But color blindness as an idea suffers a much more serious crisis than simply being outdated. It has not so much gone out of fashion with a younger generation in South Africa as having been rejected from first principles. The color consciousness of the younger generation presents the logical conclusion of multiracialism and the Rainbow Nation. The idea now, of course, is that color tells you about the person's values, beliefs, aspirations, ideology, etc. And it is this which needs to be challenged. There is a nationalist and parochial tide sweeping much of the globe, and the question of whether non-racialism is best conceived as multiracialism or the non-existence of race, as supported by the likes of Neville Alexander and Robert Sobukwe, cuts to the very core of the kind of society we are building. It has yet to be settled, in my opinion, but it does burn at the center of our social divisions. The path of multiracialism is a future where we need always grapple with our inherent racial differences and struggle to reconcile them to a common purpose. This will be an ongoing struggle. The path of non-racialism, however, is the hope of a future where our skin color does not inherently imply difference. There will, of course, always be other differences to be reconciled. I don't imagine that a non-racial society will be one where there are no longer any differences at all. There will be differences of culture, of language, of values, but not of race. It is possibly a future where the beast of race has been tamed and largely left in the past as an artifact of history. But is this not race denialism, some may ask? Now, of course it is. I used to be hesitant about this point and shy to call myself a race denialist, because people call, being called a race denialist sounds like you're being accused of something very monstrous and egregious. But it is important to be precise what it is that is being denied, because of course if you follow this view, you are a race denialist. But racism and racial prejudice and hate speech on the basis of race and many other harms based on false racial belief do exist, as I pointed out earlier. But they are carried out importantly by those who have a false belief in race. Without the false belief in race, we dramatically reduce the likelihood that somebody would be racist, practice racial prejudice or racial bias if that initial belief does not exist. So that is an important part of saying that actually, yes, it perhaps is race denialism, but that is precisely what we are advocating for. Now, it is important to add, I think I already have done, but one can never emphasize an important disclaimer enough to say that racial bias exists. Various studies support the hypothesis that most humans display a bias against outgroups, that is, people who are different from them. And after releasing a study on unconscious bias in 2015, a senior editor from the Pew Research Center explained that most of these implicit racial biases are consequences of subtle messages in the media, popular culture, that suggest one group is good and another group is bad, and associating with one group a crime and the other group an accomplishment. Some hope then in placing racial requirements, there is some hope therefore, if that is the case, in the possibility of eradicating the belief in race. Some do hope that by putting in place racial requirements, we will eventually address discrimination and promote diversity. I just want to address this point because far from it. The exploitation of apartheid race categories is likely to in fact frustrate attempts to eliminate discrimination. In the workplace, a commonly identified concern is the harmful stereotype that black people are less competent. Compromising the process of merit-based appointments results precisely in the reinforcing of that stereotype, not in its rebuttal. It is also worth mentioning that around the world, those belonging to the LGBTQ as well as immigrant groups also suffer prejudicial treatment in society and in the workplace. Yet most countries seem to feel that we can address these other types of group discrimination without policies promoting the preferential selection of such groups in hiring practices, in university selection, or in broader economic policy. So the point is this: just because we do not preferentially hire immigrants or say lesbians does not mean that xenophobia or homophobia do not matter. So if that is the case, similarly, race matters, but we do not, or rather the false belief in race of course matters and continues to matter in society, but we do not need race preferential policies to exhibit that. Discriminatory attitudes are often deeply embedded and they are difficult to shake, and addressing discriminatory attitudes will not be addressed by preferential selection on the basis of race. They will, however, be addressed by education, a continued dialogue on the myth of race, which we do not call it that at the moment, strong leadership, cultural interaction, and policies which tackle disadvantage head-on. Socioeconomic differences are largely responsible for keeping people of what appears to be different races in different schools, in different neighborhoods, and exposes them to different sporting and cultural opportunities. There is no preferential selection policy that can close such a gulf. The good news, of course, is really the changeable nature of social and economic conditions. We can go a long way towards changing stereotypes by decoupling skin color from wealth, interests, and beliefs. And the surest way to do that is to close the socio-economic gap, which contributes to vastly different life experiences. So the differences really that we see in society are differences in life experiences, not differences due to one's skin color. Education, economic growth, and cultural diffusion will do far more for tackling discrimination than race preference policies. Now, it will not have escaped you that earlier on I mentioned Neville Alexander and Robert Sobukwe as examples of people who espoused a more coherent meaning of non-racialism than that which is often spoken of today. They are not your traditional liberals, though to be fair, I am growing wary of the debate about who is a liberal, a libertarian, a social liberal, a bleeding heart libertarian. I'm not quite sure anymore whether that debate can ever be settled. It's perhaps an intractable one. What I do care about, however, is whether we can come to a commonly agreed to set of values. It's also worth realizing that it is a tough task to get people to agree to one value, let alone to be on the same page on several values, which is why perhaps we need to cut our losses when we can and work together where we do agree. And on the issue of non-racialism, I think liberals will have to find what they may consider to be strange bedfellows. Each political ideology comes with its own lexicon, mannerisms, and ways of communicating. And whether we like it or not, how something is communicated and by whom often does matter. I have tried this social experiment in convincing people about non-racialism. And I often quote this. A gentleman said that I believe that the minister's comments should spark a national debate on the question of what we mean by a non-racial, democratic South Africa. For it is a fact that racialized identities as we know them from situations such as Nazi Germany, Rwanda, and many others have genocidal potential. Now, when I say that this quote, that racial identities have genocidal potential, when I say that it comes from a socialist academic, Neville Alexander, and what he said in a lecture delivered at the University of Fort Hare, the reception is entirely different to if I were to say this is a quote from Tony Leon made in Parliament in the 90s. And yet this was said by Neville Alexander, a socialist academic, in the 2000s in his lecture at the University of Fort Hare. So I think the trick is not to erase our own proud liberal history in the fight against non-racialism, but perhaps to complement it with the words and ideas from others with whom we share vast differences on other issues, but commonalities on the issue of non-racialism. And we also need to seek out those still alive today who may not be economic liberals, but who draw inspiration from the likes of Neville Alexander and Robert Sobukwe, who fought for very much the kind of non-racialism I've spoken about tonight, and will not be considered perhaps today liberals in the traditional sense. The fight for non-racialism will appear broader, deeper, and stronger than just an agenda of fringe ultra-liberals. Thank you. Should I sit down again?
Yeah, I'll call you back up when I'm done. Thanks. So what have we learned about South African liberalism tonight? South African liberalism has its roots in the British liberalism that existed in the 19th century. Some call this Gladstonian liberalism, after Queen Victoria's Prime Minister William Gladstone. This classical form of liberalism emphasized free markets, freedom of choice, limited government, and self-help, something today erroneously called conservatism. We in South Africa were therefore fortunate to have largely missed the infusion of welfarism into liberalism that would come later in Britain and today permeates especially the liberalism that we know in the United States. But over recent years, many who describe themselves as part of the liberal camp have attempted to argue that free enterprise is not part and parcel of South African liberalism. And these people, many of whom were found in the 1980s, seem to have been overcome by a guilt complex. They ask themselves whether it is fair to have a free market when the apartheid government so relentlessly oppressed blacks and so much stands to be redressed in light of that. Surely redress is an imperative, and we cannot subscribe to a free market that will simply entrench in existing inequalities. The guilt complex messes with one's mind. Whereas one previously understood and appreciated that a free market is not only a moral imperative, but also the most uplifting and empowering economic model out there, they forget it all and become obsessed with consciously fighting against the so-called problem of inequality. We must and do remind those overcome with guilt that if they want to eliminate destitution, the free market is today, as it was back then, still the best way to do so by far. Socialism and interventionism do not miraculously become workable simply because justice needs to be done for those oppressed in the past. The free market, the liberated economy, is part and parcel of South African liberalism today as it has ever been. Indeed, in 1994, in an in-depth study, Timothy Hughes set out the uniting principles of South African liberalism. These include a dedication to the free market, but let me summarize all 7 principles. The first is individualism. The individual must be the object of emphasis in political institutions, and equality at law must be observed. The principle was particularly relevant for liberals in light of the racial discrimination that the apartheid government perpetrated up to the end of that regime's tenure. The second is what might be called the Malayan Principle, which focuses on individual personality, the development of which is enabled by free thought, free expression, free movement, free association, and freedom of conscience, excluding the free market. The third is what might be called the Dacian rule of law or constitutionalist principle. The rule of law is a necessary condition for freedom to exist. The apartheid government, and arguably government today, often flouts this principle with its discretionary and often arbitrary rule. The fourth is pragmatism. In other words, liberals are aware of the reality in which they live and react to it based on reason and evidence. In fact, liberals have something of an obsession with facts and logic, often to their own detriment, I must add. But this pragmatic principle does not displace the core liberal focus on individual freedom. The liberals who slid away during the 1980s up to today elevated pragmatism over and above the other principles, even if their pragmatism itself is very much doubtful. The fifth principle is institutionalism. Liberty requires strong institutions that are aimed specifically at checking and balancing public power. This principle is closely related to the rule of law. The sixth principle, of course, is free enterprise. The free market tends to produce more wealth and prosperity for everyone. The apartheid government only started to respect free enterprise towards the end of its rule, and the present government only respected free enterprise at the beginning of its rule. But whenever it was tried in South Africa, economic growth was simply higher and the future was bright, and liberals still make this point today. And the final and perhaps most controversial aspect of South African liberalism specifically is gradualism, as opposed to radicalism or revolution. During apartheid and today, arguably, liberals want political change to come about through constitutional and usually electoral means. Liberals do not reach for the gun or break out into militant protests, but subtly try to influence the course of political events, mostly through discourse, persuasion, and convincing people of the merit of our ideas. We saw this most clearly with the liberal adoption of the qualified franchise as a compromise between white minority rule and one man, one vote majoritarianism. Now, whether this gradualism serves us as liberals well, I think is open to debate, but let's not get into that now. But let's stop for a moment at the free market principle. Many people, liberals included, especially South African liberals, treat free markets as ancillary to so-called personal freedom. It is often said, for instance, that freedom of expression is the most important freedom that people have. I agree with the sentiment that free expression is fundamental, but the way property rights are often relegated to an afterthought is somewhat disconcerting. Our freedom of expression is meaningless without private property and free enterprise. I can only stand here before you tonight using my free expression because this podium and this organization are private property. If this were North Korea, where the notion of private property is virtually non-existent, an event like this would be impossible. But let's say North Korea respected free expression. I would still have to apply to use the so-called public venue and jump through various bureaucratic hoops to finally get an opportunity to speak. Without property rights, free expression, and indeed virtually every other true right imaginable, is at best in a precarious position and at worst non-existent. This highlights the fact that a free market is not only the most effective economic model, which produces prosperity and wealth, but it is also a moral imperative. As lawyers would put it, a free market with secure property rights is the conditio sine qua non, the indispensable condition of a free and open society. And this is why expropriation without compensation is today an existential threat to the free society that we have built here since 1994. There are people in the liberal camp who excuse it, and say that it is all about redress and therefore necessary. This is short-sighted and amounts to nothing more than gobbling up politically expedient rhetoric that amounts to nothing more than lies. But in light of all of this, what are the prospects for liberalism in South Africa? Liberals seem to have abandoned their posts. The myth that was adopted wholeheartedly during the course of the 1990s and early 2000s was that liberalism had achieved its purpose, being the end of apartheid and the adoption of a supreme constitution, and that the liberals could now safely and comfortably retire, as many of them did. The mentality extended mostly to wealthy South Africans who, surprisingly, most of whom seemed to be liberals during the runtime of apartheid. And they funded liberal causes, but this ceased as the new dispensation came into being. We saw a string of liberal organizations shut down, like the Jan Hendrik Hofmeyer Memorial Trust, the South African Liberal Students Organization, the Liberal Forum, and many others. In many ways, only the Free Market Foundation and the Institute of Race Relations remained as fixtures in liberal civil society. Even the Black Sash, born as a liberal organization in the 1950s, flirted with Marxism in the 1980s and is today simply a type of charity organization. The desire to stand up as liberals per se and fight for liberal causes per se seems to have left most liberals. This makes the prospects of liberalism in South Africa dire. We cannot rely simply on facts to convince people of the superiority and indeed necessity of a particular worldview. Many liberals errantly believe that things simply need to go pear-shaped in South Africa for millions to realize the necessity of a free market. Once things collapse, everyone will come to a collective realization that we need to change and reform to a free market. I think that's false. Others believe that if a liberal party simply governs a municipality or a province properly and effectively, the people living there will become convinced of how liberalism serves their needs better. I think this has also proven to be false. We need to be explicitly liberal. We need to call it that, liberal. Living in a liberal system and reaping the liberal rewards of a liberal economy is insufficient. People must see and be told that what they are experiencing is liberalism and the rewards of that. Otherwise, it will go right over their heads and liberalism will win no victories. But can we win victories in South Africa? And I think the answer to that can only be yes. Some theorists like Nicholas Taleb have observed that wide-ranging societal change is rarely brought about by real majoritarian action. Almost without exception, change is instigated and seen through by a vocal, dedicated, and determined minority. When liberals observe that the so-called majority in South Africa are not liberal and therefore that our task is impossible, they are incorrect. Our job as liberals is actually remarkably easy. And all it takes is persistence and particularly activity. Simple activity, just be an active liberal is actually all that is required, but we have a lot of trouble with that. If we wait for liberty to come, it never will. We also have a profoundly liberal constitution, something that many liberals tend to miss, even liberal legal scholars, which is unforgivable. The liberal positions that we have advocated for in South Africa for centuries found great favor in both the National Party and the African National Congress when they were engaged in negotiations, even if it was only for expediency's sake. Liberalism was, and might still be to some extent, in the ANC's bones. All that organizations proposed bills of rights right up to the 1940s, some time ago I concede, were essentially liberal democratic, and the right to own property was key in all of them. The NP always rejected liberalism in principle right up until the 1980s, when it somewhat surprisingly shifted quite radically into the liberal-ishism when Andries Tjörnicht and the conservatives broke away. The Constitution, unlike most around the world, explicitly entrenches the concept of the rule of law and the advancement of human rights and freedoms in its foundational provisions, Section 1. The right to property, as it currently is stated in Section 25 before the Constitution is perverted by the 18th Amendment, is quite strongly worded, as is the right to freedom of expression in Section 16.1. As are other rights, the right to freedom of association is unqualified, Section 18. We have the right to freedom of association, there's no proviso to that, yet this is totally disregarded by government and totally ignored by liberals. So like their activism, liberals have abandoned the constitution as a liberal instrument and ceded it entirely to left-leaning authoritarians. You have a greater chance of hearing liberals complaining about the constitution than to actually hear them advancing a liberal interpretation of it, as all laws should be interpreted. We have a rich and strong tradition to reclaim, and we have the instruments at our disposal to make that tradition work. Now that is my contribution for this evening, but I would like to make one final note that's somewhat related, but not specifically. The last 25 years in South Africa and perhaps around the world has been one of general left-wing domination. Not necessarily socialist or communist, but at least center-left hegemony. Classical liberals tend to sit neither on the left or right, or center for that matter, given that we believe in simple individual liberty rather than authority or equality. But things are changing, and they are changing relatively quickly. The so-called right wing is regrouping, nowadays under the name of so-called national conservatism. It is my view that they represent a future threat to liberty that our current socialist rivals cannot match. And this is because of the explicit national conservative of the universality of the right to be free, something that the left buys into even if they have a somewhat perverted conception of freedom. All I ask is that we be mindful of this and keep an eye out on these developments and not necessarily obsess so much over the left that we do not see this creeping right-wing authoritarianism that may violently assert itself in the near future. Me and my speakers will now take your questions. I invite them back to the stage. When you do ask a question, please say who you're directing it to. It can be to one of us or all of us. Comments are welcome, but should be kept short, and your questions should please be as clear and concise as possible. Thank you. Mark, please.
Mark Oppenheimer from the Johannesburg Bar. Thank you all for really fantastic talks. I think you address issues that are of great importance for our nation at the moment. If you could each very briefly say what it is you intend on doing as part of your respective organizations to stop expropriation by compensation in this case.
Could you all, but specifically the year?
Do either of you wish to start?
Well, I sit in the back office, so I'm not fully aware of everything that the Institute's doing, but we are writing a huge amount of stuff in whatever forum is available to us, mostly social media, websites, because the mainstream press, well, we don't need to go into that. And the Institute is also organizing petitions and campaigns among various constituencies to get them to declare themselves. There's a campaign focused on the banks, to get the banks to say whether or not they favor expropriation without compensation, and that's quite difficult to get them to declare themselves. And the second is agricultural organizations, and in particular to try and get the whole agricultural community, including individual farmers and agribusinesses, to get agricultural organizations, abuzz, the South African Agricultural Union, whatever it's called now, Agri-SA, to declare themselves. And that's quite a battle, because many of them are reluctant to say anything that might antagonize the government, jeopardize the country's ratings by Fitch, whoever it might be, and so on. That's what I know that we're doing, and there's probably a lot going on that I don't know about.
I suppose the important thing to say is that, I mean, from the very beginning, the DA tried to stop this from, the particular amendment to the Constitution from being made. The obvious point right at the beginning was that a lot of the work was in large part duplicative, because there was an excellent high-level panel report that detailed what had gone wrong in the land reform process, which taken seriously could go a long way to ensuring that a proper land reform process is underway that has very little to do with needing to alter the constitution. But as things stand, being in opposition and not having the majority vote, what we can do is, of course, oppose it whenever it is before Parliament, which we do. But ultimately, I think you can have all the petitions and submissions you want, which we also have done, of course. You can lobby the private sector, most importantly, to join the fight, and that is critical because we have seen in the past that the dangers, the risks, properly explained and properly lobbied for by the private sector, as we kind of had in the moment when everyone was jumped on the anti-Zuma bandwagon with Save SA, etc. There can be enough of a private sector push to actually arrest government in its tracks and what it's trying to do. So, of course, that's an important component of hoping that even if it's at the last minute, the private sector will eventually come on board. I think at the moment, many CEOs and people in the private sector under the illusion that it won't be as bad as perhaps people think, that true expropriation without compensation will only occur in only very niche scenarios. So they've set out some of the areas where you're holding a speculative asset, where you can show that you did not purchase the asset originally. So a lot of people think that it has been defined in ways in which this would apply to very few people, and many are holding out in that hope that this is not something that will apply to them. So that's the first hurdle, is convincing people that, well, you give them an inch, and this is the first step necessary to eventually a lot more leniency on the kind of categories that will later on actually qualify for expropriation without compensation. But ultimately, all of that being done, the oppositions in Parliament, the lobbying for the private sector and private citizens to jump on board and to apply their weight, the only true last bulwark against this going through is a constitutional or a court challenge. And I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the party, but I have no doubt that should it get to that stage, that will be something that will be seriously considered. And considering our track record in fighting such matters through the courts, I think that will be a very likely route that we will have to take. And I must say, it's eventually it's the last measure. And if it goes through the Concourt, and I must say, I would also warn people about setting too high expectations about what that Concourt judgment will deliver, because there are some judges who have said that they don't, or at least, I don't know if they're retired judges, but there are some very senior legal experts who have weighed in on expropriation without compensation and said in their mind it need not necessarily conflict with the Constitution. So, it's the last kind of stopgap measure, but I also wouldn't put in 100% confidence that it will be stopped at that stage. I think there's every possibility the Constitutional Court says, with these provisos, there's nothing, expropriation without compensation does not contradict private property rights. And that obviously would be a dangerous place to be in, but I wouldn't rule it off as a possibility.
Well, speaking for the Free Market Foundation, now we're a multifaceted organization. I'm obviously only in charge of the legal arguments, legal research, so I can speak quite authoritatively on that. But I can say that we are engaged in discussions both locally and internationally, both with those who are in favor of expropriation and those who are against, trying to convince them of their errant ways, especially if they're in favor. Yeah, and all of you, I presume, know about our Kaya Lam project that is really making property rights real for people around the country, people who previously have had very little experience of having real property in their name, in title, freehold title. And that is something we really hope will influence the climate of public opinion, especially poor black people who have very recently only begun to experience the benefits of home ownership, etc., to understand the threat that expropriation without compensation could have for them. On my front, what I'm mostly busy with is formulating legal arguments for a potential court challenge. I can mention two of them. I don't want to get into too deep jurisprudence here. The first that was made clear at the FMF quite early on after the announcement of the resolution to amend the Constitution was discussed here by Professor Robert Vivian, who is here with us tonight. The idea that you do not simply need a 2/3 majority to amend the Constitution to take away the right to compensation in Section 25, but in fact the act of doing so would undermine aspects of our founding provisions, Section 1, which must be amended by a 75% majority. And that includes values such as the advancement of human rights and freedoms and the rule of law. So that is one argument that I believe the DA has picked up on, and other organizations. And the second main argument is the idea that expropriation without compensation is so incongruent with the structure of the Constitution, the very logic of our Constitution as an instrument to protect rights rather than to infringe on them, that it cannot be seen as an amendment, but rather a new constitution that is being enacted by by Parliament, and that is a power that Parliament does not have. It can only amend the constitution. It cannot revoke it and enact a new one, and that is the so-called basic structure argument. So that is what I'm working on, but there are many moving parts at the FMF, and a lot of that is directed at influencing the discourse, the climate of opinion.
Mark, I think you can rest assured that the Institute is going through the proposed amendments and all other relevant documents, clause by clause, with a view to seeing what can be challenged, whether procedurally or substantively. And I think we've learned one thing beneficial. It wasn't the lesson he intended to teach, but we've learnt it from Jacob Zuma, that you fight this thing a Stalingrad type rearguard action. And that's what will have to be done.
Sorry, I don't want to labor like this one question, but I did also just want to add, just because I think it's so important what you mentioned about the FMF rolling out title deeds, and certainly where we govern, it's also something we've been trying to expedite, but I think it's probably something that should have been the focus of government much earlier, and perhaps it's been purposely not been the focus of government to afford people property rights, because you can't appreciate, well, it's in some cases more difficult to appreciate what you don't have. And it always reminds me of a quote, I don't know who said it, but I know it's not mine, I know I came across it somewhere, that it's the problem is not that people aren't conservative, and he was talking in an economic sense. The problem is not that people aren't conservative, the problem is that people have nothing to conserve. And that actually makes a lot of sense. When people don't have anything to conserve, they are much less likely to be defenders of private property rights and all these others. So it's so important to give people a skin in the game.
David, please.
David Ansara from the Centre for Risk Analysis at IRR. Gwen, you gave a very passionate defense of non-racialism and distinguished it very clearly from multiracialism. And given the history of South Africa and the various abuses that took place at the hands of the state, there's clearly a need for redress. What does a non-racial approach to redress look like, and how does that play out in terms of policy?
Are we just doing one after each other? Sure. Well, I mean, of course, having, our values and principles document was released this week, and so everyone's kind of preempting that next policy step, which we haven't, put out there, what exactly then an economic policy that's not based on race would look like. But we will be doing that in the next coming weeks. I just want to say that obviously I can answer your question, I want to do so, but, to perhaps this whole evening is with my DA policy hat off, because I don't want to speak on behalf of the parties. It's entirely my own personal opinion, but it's very easy to do redress without recourse to race. In fact, what you ideally, in the beginning, and I don't mean in the beginning of time or whatever in some grand sense, I just mean in the at the beginning of kind of our constitutional dispensation, and I've gone through the kind of parliamentary records when you looked at the discussions that were happening at the time when employment equity and black economic empowerment discussions were taking place. And in the early 90s, there was very much, or late 90s, a consensus, and even amongst, if you read what ANC members were saying in Parliament, they were saying that we don't want to go back to these apartheid racial categories, but it's somehow a necessary evil in order to achieve redress that we are now having to continue to use them. So if people are talking about race categories in necessary evil terms, one would assume, therefore, that the ideal way to do redress is if you could possibly address disadvantage or historical injustice whilst at the same time not resorting to apartheid racial categories. And I think, that very much can be done. And it can be done primarily because in South Africa, unlike other countries where perhaps it was a minority that was, oppressed or discriminated against, precisely because the majority in South Africa are those who were historically disadvantaged, you can have a policy based on pure disadvantage without recourse to race, and you can be guaranteed the principal beneficiaries will be black South Africans. It would be impossible in South Africa to have disadvantage-based policies and say the principal beneficiaries would be white South Africans. That you can't say both things. So the majority of South Africans who are disadvantaged are black is a statement that cannot be made with another statement that says if you have disadvantage-based policies, the principal beneficiaries will be white. That doesn't make sense. So it would have been to me a no-brainer even in the early 90s or mid-90s when these policies were being instituted that you didn't need to have recourse to racial categories at all, precisely because you were dealing with a majority disadvantaged population just by having policies that address early childhood malnutrition, disparities in educational outcomes, spatial inequalities. By addressing all of these very real material disadvantages without recourse to race, the principal beneficiaries would be those who were previously classified as being black. So it's obviously, over time, a particular idea becomes hegemonic, and I think there is a race-based redress hegemony in South Africa, and to be opposed to race-based redress is to be opposed to redress, apparently. So it's a huge hurdle of people accepting that you are approaching the issue in good faith, that you are committed to redress, but you aren't committed to doing it in a racial manner that re-racializes people. So I think that's a long, sorry. Siri on my phone sometimes comes on. But I hope in the coming weeks that'll become clearer as we release a fuller policy, because what we released this last week was just values and principles. So you can say that we stand for non-racialism, we stand for redress, but as you correctly point out, that doesn't give you the policy details. But we will in the coming week be releasing a policy based on disadvantage that will give people a clear idea of how that can be done.
Leon, and then you, ma'am.
Oh, great. 3 great talks and great comments afterwards, for which many thanks, much appreciated. A few things, 2 big things disturbed me greatly. And they're both really 2 facets of the same thing, which is the racial division that's emerged, that white people are against expropriation without black compensation, while black people are for it. And the colour of the audience and the colour of the debate makes this clear. Whether we call it multi or non-racial, I don't know. But having been a communist who participated in the Great March against Apartheid that John Kane-Berman headed, I forget what year it was, he was then a liberal, I was a communist, and we were opposing the same thing. I just want to make the point that the land titling issue that the Free Market Foundation does is not connected in any way with an alternative to expropriation without compensation. It started 45 years ago in our history. We were involved in the first title deed issued in Soweto to Richard Makonda. We were involved in the first 99-year leases, which was the closest thing we could get from PW Botha. And so our work on that is nothing to do with whether or not expropriation without compensation is a threat. But the part that's really disturbing indeed and strange is that black South Africans are not marching in the streets. If apartheid meant anything, it was black people being victims of expropriation without compensation. And I can't understand why black people condone the thought that this might happen again. They're plunging themselves straight back into apartheid, which is where the state, bearing in mind the state is thousands of officials. In the discourse, nobody talks about who expropriates. And having been a practicing lawyer dealing with expropriation, let me explain. The right to expropriate is in the hands of thousands of petty officials. The parks manager in Arnslate, the road maintenance person, the Eskom expropriates land for power stations, and that every black South African will be subject to somebody who doesn't like them, somebody who's from the wrong political party, the wrong religion, who is accused of having an affair with their spouse or whatever, being expropriated without compensation. The victims will not be white people. And it might be in the first few years. But what amazes me is that it's presumed that the potential victims are white people. Frankly, I would be very surprised if any white person where we are now in Bryanston is ever expropriated without compensation. I would bet money on it that the real because I'll fight it anyway, of course, the real expropriations without compensation are going to be for poor black people living in informal settlements, semi-formal settlements, RDP housing schemes, old pre-94 townships. And this idea that this is aimed at white people is just an extraordinary, distressing aberration.
Well, the Institute has made it very clear, Leon, repeatedly, that it's not going to be mainly targeted at white people.
No, the black people will be the victims.
It's been obvious that this is nationalisation of all the land in the country under the pretext of land reform. I mean, that point has been made repeatedly by my colleague Anthea Jeffrey and by Frans Cronje, by myself, by all sorts of others. So it's not a new point.
I think
Sure.
you first.
This kind of argument is so important. We're talking about the need for action on the ground with what happens to people. Now, the organization that's responsible for organizing action on the ground is the DA. You're a political party with branches, and each branch has got a mixture, even in a rich area with householders. You've got domestic workers, you've got small businessmen, you've got people with problems. But and you can address those problems like that are going to happen individually to people there. If you've got a vibrant branch, and those issues can be dealt with multiracially. For example, there can't be a ward that hasn't got a froth school on its borders or in it. And you can move in on that school, and it's got docile parents. So you can move in on that school, black and white people wanting to win an election, but they're showing that they're interested in everybody. And you can do things with that school. You can fight the teachers, you look what Sarah Gon did with Greenside School, and you can do it. She did wonders there. She sent her 2 boys there, and they both got scholarships. But the branches are not doing it. They're not, and I don't think there are enough volunteers there anymore. And I'll tell you why. I can't remember how long ago, I think it was about 10 years, when Helen Ziller, Tony Leon, and Ryan Coetzee were in the ascendancy. They emasculated their electoral college. Political correctness had arrived, and they wanted their branches to bloody well get a decent proportion of blacks, whites, Indians, colours, and what have you, and they weren't doing it. So they decided that the Federal Council must do that. So they took away the power of the branches to choose their own political representatives. Well, I stood up there and I fought it. But I disobeyed my husband's first rule, which was keep your silly mouth shut until you've got your soldiers in a row, which I did not do. It was about 10 years ago. I was 75 and I was tired. And I didn't see I don't know who I could, get your soldiers in a row, you sit on the phone day and night for a long time. And I know that because I'm a hack and all I've done all my life is organise voluntary workers. But I said to them, you are destroying your volunteer workforce. And the first time I was on Electoral College after that, a few weeks after I spoke at that conference, I was in the Electoral College, and lo and behold, we were each presented with a group of questions that had been designed for us by Deloitte and Touche, and a lot of accountants, and we weren't allowed to ask anybody any other question, all the candidates. My group interviewed Lucy Maimon in that time. And I just refused to. I said, what's the matter with you all? Just let's ignore this. Everyone was absolutely horrified. I made a bloody fool of myself and I was never nominated for Electoral College again. But that was when the rot set in and political correctness grabbed the Electoral College. And to this day, branch people have come to me and said, look here, we send a group a group of people we want to the Federal Council, and they just change it into so many whites, so many blacks, so many colours. We don't know who we're getting. You've destroyed the vibrancy of local people. And I don't think the DA has even got a workforce. So I don't hear. Now Helen Ziller's absolutely, I have to know, admitted she was wrong. So I'm glad she's there. But I haven't heard a word that the DA, and you can tell me, are they thinking of returning power to their electoral college? So you'll get vibrant, and then you don't have to worry about categories of racism and what sort of racist you believe in, and look that way, you've got white and non-white people, all colours working together on one local issue, or 2 or 3, and the natural leaders emerge from there. Your voluntary workers, the good ones and the bad ones emerge from there, and you must choose your own local leaders. If a party doesn't do that, what the heck is the use of it?
I mean, I'm going to give a very unsatisfactory answer, say that I'm not in a position to say whether they would be reviving the Electoral College or not. But what I can say is that I think, you know, as you say, Helen's admitted that that error, and I think there is absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind in the leadership currently that the introduction or being obsessed about sort of the racial aesthetics of the party was absolutely detrimental.
Yes, but you can't.
And the reality is that people will be liberals. I mean, you have white Marxists, you have black Marxists, yes, and you certainly will have black liberals and white liberals. And I think, you know, when the party got to a point, I think, where also it was growing and it became impatient. So kind of electoral victory was almost so close you could taste it. And so there was an urgency to hasten that process. And unfortunately, there were lots of black young liberals, but, you know, maybe I was 15 and others were 10 years old, and we couldn't say, hang on, we're coming, but just wait for us. You know, but I do, you know, I'm being a bit facetious, but I'm just saying that I think...
Many people with questions, this is degenerating into a post-mortem on the DA.
Well, I did want to answer those, John, just Jill briefly to say...
Let's take
Anyways,
the
in
gentleman in
fairness
the
to
back.
John, I'm just saying I think we're working on it.
Gentleman in the back over there, yes.
Peter Bursky, Johannesburg Bar. And I'm afraid this is also a question directed mainly to Gwen and the DA. But the changes that the DA have gone through in the last year to 6 months have largely, and I'm talking from a distance, but at the level of the commentariat and the chattering classes have been sort of very dismissive. From the DA has now been written off as having retreated back into its core constituency. If anything, you've retreated into a white racial country. And I'm not saying it's correct. I think I'm perhaps suggesting it's entirely incorrect. But this message of non-racialism, which you communicate very clearly, doesn't seem to have traction or have gained traction amongst our broader commentariat. Is this something we're just going to have to live with, and time will tell? I mean, how do you respond to the suggestion and when seeing the erstwhile leader resign, not the first DA leader to resign and walk away, and the mayor of Joburg? There's a feeling that in a certain sense, the DA doesn't offer anything for black people. Let's be precise. And
that's why I was suggesting the branches get...
Maybe so, and maybe it links with what Joe is saying, but I see it as an enormous challenge for the DA. I think what the DA has done is terribly exciting, but how do we get from where we are to something better?
So the first thing to say is that, I mean, that's absolutely accurate. That's the the idea of non-racialism and what we put forward doesn't gain traction in the mainstream media, but the reality is it never has. So I think, because South Africa has such a goldfish kind of memory, we live in the moment and we forget the past. But the truth is, the media wasn't giving the former leader sweetheart interviews or all over him and praising him when he was the leader of the DA. But of course, as soon as you leave the DA, then you're everyone's favorite, because it's everyone's favorite sport to hate the DA. So the moment you're anti-DA, you're suddenly lovable now. So, let's not be under any pretense that the former leader got immense criticism when he was the leader of the DA. Of course, things, as I say, change when you're no longer in the party. And the other thing about also, so the former leader, the former mayor of the city of Johannesburg, is that unfortunately, political parties are very complex organizations. You're constantly trying to keep multiple people with their own agendas on the same page at the same time. And it does boil down to largely personality politics as opposed to any real change of heart. I myself was a huge fan of the former mayor. He wrote a book, for goodness sake, called Capitalist Crusader, in which he absolutely eviscerated the idea of BE, so that now he could leave the party.
Could you try again?
Siri seems to be working against me. Sorry, someone who's more technologically advanced than I will show me how to switch that off after this talk. But essentially, he eviscerated the idea of BEs, the idea that he can now leave the DA and says, well, not in his lifetime could he ever support a party that is anti-BE. Boggles the mind. But of course, nobody reads, so nobody has read Capitalist Crusade, and so nobody can hold him to his own word and say, hello, is this the same man that wrote this book? So, many things work against, being able to counter these narratives. If you have an electorate that doesn't read, that has a memory of a goldfish, you're working against, enormous obstacles. But also the point is not to cry, be a crybaby and say, woe's me, and, how pitiful our situation is. So, okay, so what? This is the scenario. You have largely a media or commentariat that mostly, I think, does lean left ideologically. So they're not naturally inclined to understand. I spent this whole week trying to explain this idea of non-racial that I explained tonight with some, clever people, and I generally don't think it's because they don't understand. They don't want to understand. For many people, it's not rocket science. South Africans, or the media, could get South Africans to understand state capture, for goodness sake, all the intricacies of how the state was, subverted for the interests of a few. So if you can explain that kind of intricate corruption, nepotism, and all these various transactions, trust me, if you wanted to, you could explain quite clearly and succinctly to South Africans what the DA's position on non-racialism is. But they don't want to, so let's put it that way. And again, I would say that's fine, because I've never ever bought into the idea that the media is objective. I don't know who came up with this ludicrous idea. Everyone, regardless of your profession, comes from a particular ideological standpoint. And for many people, it is now impossible to divorce yourself from where you come from. So if you are a former unionist, and I'm talking in my mind of a very popular, Mark's laughing because he knows, popular journalist who's very well read and is a former unionist, I just know that there's no way ever, no matter how much I sat down with this particular journalist, explained our philosophy, that they would write something favorable, because they come from a unionist background and they are fundamentally opposed to what we have to table. So with things like that, the only hope is for a media landscape that's a lot more diverse. I don't know when that will ever happen, but I often say, actually, as vicious and all the problems that happen in the UK press, and certainly it's not a media establishment that is lauded by any stretch of the imagination, but one thing they almost do have going right is that you open the Guardian, you know what you're getting, you read the Spectator, you know what you're getting, you read the Telegraph, you know what you're getting, and I think that's so important, that it's fine for publications of the media to actually wear their hearts or their ideological inclinations on their sleeve. But in South Africa, everybody pretends that they're objective, but actually aren't objective. And I would much rather the other way around, that we know that the City Press, that's a Marxist outlet. I'm not saying they are, I'm just making an example. This publication, they're absolute, libertarians. At least then the kind of the stance or viewpoint that you're getting your information from. Anyway, so I wish that was the case, but that's not the case. And in the absence of that, we have to, the options are to either you're going to capitulate, so you're going to work out what's in this market will sell best, and let's offer voters that. And let there be no doubt, you can be that kind of party. And in fact, I think the former mayor is speedily trying to create such a party that is based on just popular majoritarianism. So ask people, what do you want? And let's deliver what people want. You're basically governing by referendum. Put every single issue out there, the death penalty, immigration, put everything out to referendum, and whatever the majority wants, that is what your party stands for. Now, that is obviously a quick ticket, potentially. We'll see how that kind of party performs, but it's potentially a quick ticket to, successful electoral performance, but you then don't stand for anything. So it's always been, I think, a tension for the DA to be a party of principle, but also to say that we don't want to just be a kind of, terrier yapping dog at the heels of the ANC. We actually are serious about being in government, so there are sometimes compromises along the way. We're not going to be purists, but you also can't go all the way over to the side of pragmatism, where you'll do whatever it takes in order to win. And you have to have bottom lines. And I think one of those bottom lines for us is, or releases what is in the process of being discussed, should be non-racialism. And if you're going to make non-racialism one of your bottom lines, you are essentially settling for the fact that as it currently stands, the majority of South Africans actually support multiracialism. They want their particular race recognized. They actually aren't living in a non-racial society. So if you want to be a party that stands for non-racialism, you have to console yourself with a certain portion or a certain cap of the votes. But if you're in the politics of the long haul, then the idea is that, well, perhaps over time we can persuade more and more people over to the idea of non-racialism. And in my mind, that's what leaders do. Leaders don't go out and say, what do you want? And I'll give it to you. Leaders have the courage to actually put forward an offer and say, well, this is my offer, take it or leave it. And, if many South Africans choose to leave the offer of non-racialism, well, that is their right. But I think 10, 30, 50 years from now, hopefully there will still be a party in South Africa, no matter how unpopular, that is willing to champion the non-racial cause.
Yeah. Forgive me that I exercise some illiberal censorship here tonight, but can the next few questions, you're already over time, be very short, and please not be directed specifically at the DA. We should just get back to the broad topic of liberalism here. I think I saw your hand first, Sigle.
Martin, I have to leave in 5 minutes.
All right, yeah, that's fine. Please.
Just very briefly, I think there is a very big battle being waged here, and it's one which is about the battle of ideas, right? The speakers on the podium basically raised the idea, rightly so, that there are black liberals in this country. The problem is, where are we, right? And I say we because I self-identify as one. But part of the mission we have, I think, those of us who sort of operate in the space, maybe not in party politics, is to try and bring those voices out, right? But here's the conflict, and this is what I want you guys to speak to. Often you find that in communities, yes, they'll listen to a liberal message that you bring out, right? Whether I'm interviewing people on the streets or whatever the case may be, but you tend to find that there's just very few points of convergence on liberalism, but mostly conservative ideals that they hold. So if I speak on, how we address the economy, the idea of devolving power and resources into the hands of the individual, really families. We talk about the individual a lot, but really we're a family society. They'll agree with that. But the moment you then speak about LGBTQI rights and any other, idea that as a classical liberal, I'll say, let people live and let live, then you get that sort of resistance. So the question therefore is, where do you strike that balance between that conservative individual who maybe supports a few of your ideals and maybe a black South African, and you're trying to win his favor, in your case his vote, versus trying to argue that you're trying to create a local culture in, let's say, for the sake of brevity, in black communities. What are your thoughts around that?
John, you can go first.
No, I talk about the history.
Oh.
Not the future problems.
All right.
A simple point I'll say to this is that, as much as I'm also a policy person, I'd love that everyone read policy documents and voted on the basis of policy. They don't. But of course, you have to have that policy foundation in order to be able to have substance behind what you're talking about when you do door-to-door visits, when you talk to people, face-to-face. But ultimately, then people are also voting on an experience, which, as I keep saying, you can't authentically have people experience your organisation or your ideas in a particular way if they aren't actually grounded in something real, if you're kind of just faking it. So the policies will always be important, but it's not that people are voting on, and that's no more... that's more apparent to us when you, for example, look at polling or, that show that if you ask people who governs better on various areas, if you ask people, who performs better in perhaps creating jobs, I think most people would say, yes, City of Cape Town, the Western Cape, or DA government, but that doesn't translate to, will you vote DA? So a lot of people are happy to recognize that, yes, the DA governs better, but that doesn't translate into the DA voting for them. And I think often that's the mistake we make, that we think that as long as you can get people to recognize a particular policy or governance point, that means they will vote for you. And so that is the tricky thing with politics, is you have to find in each community, I think also what Jill was saying, that issue that will speak to them. And I don't think it needs to cover every single, because you were saying, we have agreements on these particular issues, but not on others. The trick is to communicate on the areas where you do have agreement, and perhaps in that community to not go on the issues where there is disagreement, and hopefully that issue translates into something that is a voting issue for them, because sometimes an issue, as I point out, is not a voting, an issue that people vote on the basis on. So it is tricky, but I think it's ultimately that. And maybe one other sort of analogy that I want to make is that it's also not about telling people something. So policy isn't in many ways about telling people, okay, this is what non-racialism, whatever. But the people on the ground who are speaking to voters, who are speaking to the communities, it has to be authentic. It's kind of like, the countries that call themselves like the Democratic Republic of Congo are often not democratic. It's not about, you can say you're democratic all you like, but people don't experience it as democratic. And similarly, if you go to a butcher's and the meat there had a sign saying suitable for human consumption, you kind of think, why is it? So it's almost like the more the DA tells people it's non-racial, the more they think they don't believe them. It's like this weird thing about, there are certain things which just have to be felt and cannot be said. And the moment you make the implicit explicit, they don't trust it. And I find that always a good example about, seeing food that says suitable for human consumption. You shouldn't have to tell people that. The moment you do tell them, that's actually when they worry more. So that is actually the challenge, I think, for a party like the DS, to have people authentically feel what you believe without telling them.
Sorry, let me close with my answer to your question, because John needs to go and I would like to give him something from the FMF. But just quickly, so I think we need to be radical. Freedom is extremely exciting. I think we can make it far more exciting, less academic than we've made it. What the FMF does with Kai Alum is extremely exciting. People come out in their droves to come and receive their title deeds. It's practical. It's in your face. It's freedom works. It's freedom works on the ground. I think there are many other things that we can do that as liberals and I think we're too apologetic. We've always been apologetic as liberals. We're always constantly apologizing for what we believe in and say, sorry, yes, you're right, we should concede a little bit. I think that needs to come to a very quick end. We need to be radical. We need to be extremists for liberalism. Market fundamentalists, all these things they throw at us, I think we should wear them with pride. And I think that is how you create a narrative, a liberal narrative, a freedom narrative, a liberty narrative. And that is what people respond to, emotion narrative, rather than just cold hard facts. Most people, what I always like to say, and I think I heard this somewhere but in reverse, is that the feelings don't care about your facts. And that is simply the case, especially in South Africa. And I think liberals should adopt that to a small extent. Let me thank you all for joining us here tonight. And on behalf of the Free Market Foundation, thank you to Gwen and John for taking the time to participate in this discussion with their contributions. They are veritable experts on liberal theory, issues, history, policies, and the application of those. And as you all know, this panel discussion has been recorded. It will be on Facebook and on YouTube. The paper I mentioned earlier, like I said, is freely available. It covers much of what we said here tonight and more. Please join us for more drinks and snacks and discussion. Please have a good night, and let me thank our guests with books, because that is what liberals do. You will receive South Africa, The Solution, one of the, arguably one of the best liberal books in South Africa, as well as my book on the rule of law. Maybe that's good. There you are, Gwen. And there you are, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you.